I'm David Lombardo, and this is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're joined remotely by John Kaehny, Executive Director of the Government Transparency and Accountability Advocacy Group, Reinvent Albany, who's here to weigh in on a new state government proposal and highlight an existing state economic development practice. Well, with the World Cup coming to America this summer, state officials are looking to relax local alcohol laws and allow for the creation of so-called entertainment zones in June and July all over the state. The proposal would empower local governments to request the expansion of outdoor alcohol services. Any reactions to this idea, either as an individual economic development proposal, what it says about our alcohol laws more broadly, or something else about the relationship between state government and local governments?
Yeah, absolutely. Reinvent Albany sees this as a home rule issue. And we think local governments should be deciding when and how alcohol is served and not the state government. And to us, this is an example of state overreach into the everyday quality of life and norms of cities and towns. So, on a personal level, I think it's a great idea to have some flexibility when you have this gigantic, global fiesta taking place here in New York City and New York State. And but this is definitely something that New York City, I believe that's the origin of this proposal, that New York City should be deciding what to do. I mean, it's a city of 8.5 million people that is used to hosting mega events, that has a big, sophisticated government and knows how to do these things. So let New York City decide.
Well, yeah, where do you draw the line on that local autonomy versus having the state set the standards? Because it's one thing to say, look at the professionalism of New York City, the layers of bureaucracy. It's another thing to say, look at the city of Mechanicville in Saratoga County. Their capacity might be a little different.
Sure. Probably any place that has population over a certain size and has its own police force, for instance, is equipped to make decisions about how to manage public space versus a very, very small place that might rely on, say, the state police for its policing and might even be just a main street with a couple buildings around it. So I don't think it would be too hard to come up with criteria for who should be able to manage this kind of thing.
In your first answer, you brought up the idea of home rule, and this is a familiar topic for anybody who looks at any of the bills that come before the legislature, because municipalities need permission for a variety of things in New York, like extending certain tax rates. Does this suggest that there needs to be a broader, maybe loosening of the reins here in Albany, and maybe not just alcohol laws, but local autonomy more broadly needs to be reconsidered?
Oh, we think so. The state loves to reach in and micromanage into local government. It's the favorite thing for both parties in Albany to do. And New York State is very, very, as a state level government, is very aggressive about regulating how local governments can do things and what they can do and how they can do them, so that local governments, for instance, cannot raise any taxes other than property taxes. They can't even set speed limits or do things like try red light cameras or speed cameras or residential parking permits or things about regulating activity on their streets without Albany's approval. And then you have the state licensing all liquor establishments, which seems like a local function in a lot of ways. So why not have the state establish standards for insurance and safety and all those kinds of things that broadly affect public safety? But local government should be deciding how many bars and restaurants they want to give liquor licenses to, probably not the state. So this is just an area where the state is, interfering with what's called home rule. And New York State is a very strong central government oriented. But important thing to note here is it's not really the state versus, say, New York City, which is often the way it's depicted. It's really the state elected officials that are from that area that are the ones that are the biggest meddlers. So it's very untypical to have an upstate elected official trying to tell New York City what to do or to make laws, but it's very common to have an assembly member or senator, say from Queens or Brooklyn, who sees things differently than, say, the mayor and city council do and wants the state to interfere. So in that way, we are our own worst enemy, as is always the case, or usually the case. And you tend to have the state representatives who are the biggest meddlers into the affairs of the local government in the area they come from.
And for any listeners who are under the misconception that state lawmakers are doing a thoughtful review of these different home rule requests, I can guarantee you that things like tax extenders or, say, exceptions for where a bar might be allowed under state law are essentially rubber stamped without much notice. But I want to turn now to your bread and butter, which is the economic development subsidies world. And your organization recently highlighted the incentives for a new data center in Rockland County, which will get about $77 million in state and local sales tax abatements with the possibility of additional property tax breaks. We can get into whether this is part of a larger trend for good or bad, but how do you think taxpayers should go about evaluating this deal? Because on one end of the spectrum, there's the headline that this is going to create one permanent job, but on the other hand, there's the county IDA's estimate of $100 million in local benefits. So how do we make sense of something like this?
Well, important thing is that every single independent analysis of economic development or corporate subsidies, including New York's massive 2013 study of the same thing, has found that they don't work and they're not a good use of taxpayer funds. So on a fact basis, the assumptions of the champions of giving away tax dollars to corporations have a philosophy that's called but for. So quotation marks around but for. And the sentence is, but for these subsidies, this business wouldn't locate here and they would go somewhere else. And so that's impossible to prove or to falsify. And that thus violates basic logic and, empiricism, science, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's a really, really important thing to start with.
Well, just to interject, I understand why you would say the but-for statement can't be made with 100% certainty, but there are certain projects that I think do follow the subsidies as we see a race to the bottom in something like film production. So why wouldn't we assume something like film production, which is mobile, would follow subsidies, or maybe in this case, a data center would go where they're being offered the most lucrative benefits? I mean, why isn't that a fair assumption to make generally?
No, it's not really. So the fact is that it depends on the industry as to how much the subsidy influences the potential activity. But then there's something about the efficiency, what's called the efficiency of, like, how much are we willing to spend as taxpayers to subsidize a business to create one job?
Oh, sure. I'm just saying, though, the idea that we can't assume that the but-for thing is not reasonable to a certain degree seems not to give enough credit.
So here's why it matters and why the almost all of the return on investment analyses done by any economic development authority are BS, because they assume that 100% of the jobs or of the activity depends on that incentive. So the reality is that 100% of the economy of New York State, of the private sector jobs here, have not been created and are not located here because of government subsidies. They're here because a business sees an opportunity to make money. And so the claim that all jobs or all activity is due to subsidies is just simply complete nonsense. And in the case of this data center here in Orangetown, Rockland County, the assumption in the study done by Rockland County to somehow justify it is that JP Morgan would not locate a data center here, and therefore the construction jobs to build the data center wouldn't exist unless the subsidy was given. Now, the reality is that this data center and this project is called JPMC2, for those who want to look it up, is actually an expansion of an existing JP Morgan data center, which itself was heavily subsidized and was built in 2017. And the proposal at hand is really that JP Morgan wants to double the size of this particular data center. And so they went to the Rockland County IDA and said, hey, we want a longer property tax break. We want an extension of that period. Plus, we want an abatement or not to pay this enormous amount of sales taxes on $1 billion in new computer and air conditioning that we want to buy for this data center. And so if you look at this deal, it turns out that JP Morgan, which is, for those who don't know, one of the most profitable companies on earth and a huge investment bank, is spending about $18 billion a year building a massive, massive network of data centers globally. And their CEO has been running around talking about how JP Morgan is going to be AI capable within a few years. And this is just a tiny little part of their expansion. But because they already have an existing data center here, because that data center is zoned and is powered and all the permitting and all that stuff is done, it's an obvious place to expand. There's no delay. They can just start building on. They're literally going to build right next door and on top of an existing data center. So the idea that they're going to go somewhere completely far away is just simply not very credible. And indeed, all the independent research on this shows that what are called job location or siting decisions are influenced between 2 and 25% by subsidies, depending on the business and how transferable it is, all that stuff. So the economists say that a better way of studying this is not this unprovable but for philosophy, but instead to say, what is the opportunity cost of spending this money? As in, what does this money buy in services for the public? Schools, roads, policing, all that stuff. And that's how economists look at it, which is why this is looked at as a subsidy, as revenue that the local government and the state are not getting. And there's another whole aspect to this too, which is that most state legislators don't know, and probably nobody in the public knows, that these local industrial development agencies, which are appointed by county executives, they're called IDAs, have this power to abate state sales taxes, which are about 4% on purchases. We all pay them when we go and buy stuff at the store. So when you're JP Morgan and you're spending $1 billion, that 4% is $40 million as the state share of this data center. So taxpayers are paying for this data center expansion. The Rockland County IDA, which is part of local government there, has authorized, which is a pretty weird thing because the IDA is not elected. They're all appointed by the county executive, and the state has no say over this basically state revenue that they're giving to JP Morgan for this data center. One proposed reform would be to say, hey, we're not doing that anymore. You can't abate state sales taxes because you're a local government. So this is almost the flip side of home rule. Home rule says, hey, local government, we're not going to bother you as much as we are. But by the same token, it doesn't make a lot of sense for a local government to be able to spend state money without the states say so, or the state's voters say so. So on top of that, a key thing about IDAs, which we're super opposed to generally because we think that billions of dollars, roughly $4 billion a year, they're siphoning out of local tax bases, is creating a real crisis in local finances, especially when combined with the 2% tax cap that's in place. These local IDAs actually pay for their own budgets and their staff, and importantly, their private legal law firms through commissions on the tax dollars they're giving away, which is kind of a mind boggler because it creates what we call a perverse incentive. The more tax dollars they give away, the more money they get in commission. So, for instance, the law firm that wrote up the paper for this deal, for this one data center in Orangetown, this JP Morgan data center, made $2.5 million in commission on that deal. That's not charging fees or anything. That's in commission. So there's no other part of government that works on a commission basis. Nobody works on commission. The people that collect taxes don't work on commission. The cops don't, teachers don't, nobody does. So it's a really odd thing that these industrial development agencies literally work on commission and have these giant windfalls from these huge projects. And the problem is that they're acting in the role of reviewing the projects, the applications for projects, and funding them and getting a commission. And there's nobody representing the taxpayer in this entire discussion. And so we think this is a humongous problem because New York State, at the state and local level, is giving away $11 billion a year in corporate subsidies. And when you look at that and you look at the fact that so many local governments in New York are dead broke right now and screaming for help from the state, and then there's these arguments over a couple $100 million there, a couple $100 million here in state aid, that is such an enormous amount of money. And it's so large that it's affecting the basic finances of local government in New York State. And people need to start paying attention to it that way. This just happens to be a data center project that we're talking about here, which create very few jobs. But there's an enormous number of mega subsidy projects all over New York. They're sucking the tax base dry.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this conversation. We've been speaking with John Kaehny. He's the executive director of the Government Transparency and Accountability Group, Reinvent Albany. John, thanks so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to today's edition of the Capitol Press Room. For an insider take on what's happening in state government, check out our Dispatches from Planet Albany show, available wherever you get podcasts or at capitolpressroom.org.
Join us again for Capitol Press Room, a production of WCNY Connected, Syracuse.